While told in the third person, this story is inspired by a real event which I was privy to. This place exists, and there's something hideous waiting there, in the ancient woodland of Scotland. Hey guys, I'm Brent, and this is my dark corner, which is ironically well illuminated. And this is one more episode of the Midnight Post, a place where we dive into strange and chilling creepypastas that might just keep you up at night. If you like this type of content, don't forget to like and subscribe. I've got more of them coming your way. Today's story, it's called Off the Beaten Path. It had already been 11 months since Robert Francis had taken a single day off, so spending 8 days cycling through the Scottish wilderness all by himself seemed like a great idea. His plan was to catch the first train to Milngavie, then cycle to Queen Elizabeth Park, one of the largest nature reserves in Scotland. Around 6 in the evening, the sun was already setting. That's when Robert decided it was time to start looking for a place to camp. And soon he came across the perfect clearing to pitch his tent. As the sunlight gave way to the darkness of night, Robert had already set up camp and lit a small fire. The next morning, Robert put out the fire, packed up his things, and got back on the road. About an hour into the ride, the landscape began to change. It grew wilder, denser, and more rugged, and less cared for, as if even the park rangers avoided going that far. And soon he would find out why. As heavy rain seemed to be on its way with thick clouds rolling in, he hurried to set up camp again at the base of a hill and went off to look for firewood. The problem was, the spot he had picked had more grass and shrubs than actual trees, so if he wanted to build a fire, he'd had to walk to one of the nearby wooded areas. A collection of pine and fir trees, which seemed to form an isolated island of woodland about half a mile across, was close enough to his camp. After some minutes of trudging through the long green grass, occasionally sinking his foot unwittingly into remnants of a marshy bog, Robert found himself at the edge of the woods. The broken trunks of once beautiful and majestic pines and sycamores laid at the ground, open rotting from the inside, not unlike a poor wounded animal. It occurred to Robert that these woods seemed somehow out of place. The trees did not belong to the landscape as the others did. The long grass which characterized the entire area seemed to thin out and change from a healthy green to a morbid yellow-brown. As this thought ruminated, accompanied by an increasing sense of unexplainable dread, Robert realized that he was looking at a large, dead ring of grass that followed the tree line perfectly, encircling that pocket of woodland as if marking the limits of a tomb. On their own, in a forgotten part of the world, many would have been cautious of such a sight, but Robert quickly shook off his initial vigilance. Finding the area to be an intriguing natural occurrence, he stepped over the woodland threshold into the dim light within with a bold stride. It had started to rain. It made sense for him to head back and get a fire started as soon as possible, because once everything was wet, it would prove increasingly difficult to do so. He quickly gathered the last of the wood into his arms, but just as he turned to leave, planning to follow his own tracks on the pine-covered floor out of those unnerving woods, something caught his eye. Several feet away, obscured by a ring of trees particularly close to one another, appeared to be a strange arrangement of stones on the ground. And what did he do, just like any horror story protagonist would? Yeah, he went to check it out. After clawing his way through a net of branches, he found himself staring at what looked suspiciously like a grave. Hundreds of uneven gray stones, the size of a fist, and some substantially bigger, had been piled on top of one another, about 3 feet wide, 7 feet long, and a couple of feet off the ground. It looked as though a mourner had marked the resting place of a body. A shudder cracked up Robert's spine as he momentarily experienced a feeling as if he were being watched. But that uneasy feeling faded when he noticed several belongings scattered on the ground. Empty beer cans, an old hoodie, a sleeping bag, scraps of newspaper, and even some rusty food tins. Robert felt relieved, thinking it was just an abandoned campsite. One thing about the stone configuration, however, intrigued him. Sticking out between two plain gray rocks on the side of the pile was a stone which appeared to be markedly different from the rest. Triangular in shape, it was wider than a human hand, smooth in places, and not dissimilar to black marble, tapering off to a dull point at one end. Before he really considered it with any degree of scrutiny, Robert dropped the firewood, bent over and tugged at the stone. It felt polished and cold in his hands, but it seemed to not wish to leave its home, wedged as it was so tightly amongst the other rocks. Growing slightly exasperated, Robert wrapped both his hands around the stone and finally, with an exerted judder backwards, it was free. Staring at it intently, it looked suspiciously like an ancient axe head. Whether it was or not, Robert was not qualified to answer, but it certainly looked like a man-made object, and he could see chisel marks along its side. Perhaps the previous campers had found it nearby and then used the rock in their construction without knowing of its significance. Pocketing the stone, he bent over to pick up the firewood, but as he did so, he heard a noise. It appeared as though one of the stones on a pile had slid off and landed on the ground. A creeping sense of unease slowly started to exert itself upon Robert's nerves. He quickly picked up the firewood, lifted the rest of the stones and moved, and began to make his way back. With every step, something deep within himself was telling Robert that he was no longer alone, and in fact, that he was being followed by someone in the woods. But with every glance backwards, he could see nothing. A few times he even fancied that he heard the sound of twigs and pines cracking underfoot, but again, no one was there. Breathing a sigh of relief, the tree line came into view, and Robert was filled with daylight, knowing that in a few moments he would be back out in the open. But just before he reached the periphery of the woods, he heard a crack again. This time it was definite. It was louder than before, more pronounced, and accompanied by the hairs on the back of his neck rising in unison. He was convinced that someone was just a few meters behind him, watching. Caught between the fear of knowing and the fear of not knowing, Robert finally turned around slowly. There it was. He saw it, just for a few seconds, but he saw it. A shoulder or an arm, something slipping out of sight behind a nearby tree. Man, I can totally imagine his desperation. Imagine being in a huge forest, appearing all alone, and then out of nowhere you see someone following you. As he edged slowly towards the grassy plain outside, the subtle foreboding sound of leaves rustling and swaying, almost in anger, progressed into a rising noise. But there was no wind to gust, no breeze to disturb. There was only one conclusion to be reached. Something was moving. And then he was outside, out of the woods, away from whoever had been following. No, not following, stalking him. And then I read. Robert was not a superstitious man. You could not afford to be when camping alone in such remote locations, as the mind tends to play tricks twisting the benign sounds of nature into something much more malevolent. But regardless, he did not wish to stay around long enough to find out who his unwanted companion in the woods had been. Dear Robert, maybe being a little superstitious could have saved you from getting yourself into a situation like this. Dropping all but the sturdiest piece of wood, which Robert reckoned would make a good makeshift weapon, he ran as fast as he could toward his own camp, all the while glancing back at the strange island of trees surrounded by dead grass. But nothing emerged from within it. Arriving at his tent, out of breath and agitated, Robert packed up his belongings as quickly as possible, carrying his bike up a hill and back onto the dirt path. Waiting not one moment longer, he cycled hard and fast, hoping to put as much as distance between himself and that place and its strange resident, before finding somewhere safer and more welcoming to camp. The road was now nothing but a single track of mud, which covered Robert in a shower of dirt every time his bike sloshed through an uneven depression in the ground. Robert tried to continue onwards for as long as he could, hoping to leave the necessity of making camp into the last usable ray of sunlight. But after a couple of hours, the skies opened further and the rain came down in sheets. He had to find shelter, and quick. Using some dried roots, grass, and twigs from the forest floor, he was able to start a small campfire, which allowed him to cook some food while raising his spirits. Night began to close in, and the wind and rain diminished. With that, Robert began trying to rationalize what had happened earlier. Robert relaxed a bit. Yes, he actually relaxed after that bizarre experience. He put his hand in his pocket, then pulled out the strangely shaped stone, then drift off in thought. But something got his attention. A noise. The sound of some animal's footsteps in the distance, somewhere in the forest. It repeated again and again, with only a moment's pause between utterances, and it was an utterance of some description. An animal, perhaps? Robert could not identify it. Despite his impressive knowledge of the local wildlife, the sound possessed strange characteristics of a creature unknown to him. In some ways, it was reminiscent of a bird of prey, parts high-pitched and shrieking, but under that lay a painful, wretched noise, more akin to of a fox crying in the night looking for its young. That wasn't it exactly. It sounded like it was looking for something. For the next 3 hours, Robert lay awake, listening to the scratching noise ebb and flow as whatever was producing it moved closer, then farther away. As he eventually drifted towards sleep, the thought occurred to him that the movement of the sound was not unlike that of a search party, yelling and shouting, looking for someone lost in the wilderness, following a distinct search pattern. In the cold light of day, the noise was gone, and while Robert had accepted that what had scared him yesterday was simply a timid camper cautious of a stranger nearby, he still could not shake a feeling of impending dread tip from the pit of his stomach. Of course not! Who wouldn't still be scared after a night like that? How did he even manage to sleep? Well, that day he did make some progress, but not with the same joy as before. There was a weight on his shoulders, something suffocating him. That night he camped in another clearing, and once again that horrible scream echoed through the night. But this time it was closer. What did he decide? To ignore it again, and down south it was just a servant wandering around. The next day was still cloudy, but at least it wasn't raining, and Robert realized at some point he had veered off his original route. Even though he sometimes stopped to take in the scenery, he tried to keep his distance from the woods and the forests. He had the feeling that something inside them was watching him. The path he had been on for the last couple of hours had been rather predictable for the most part, but now it curved sharply around a grassy hill. A long stretch of dirt and uneven track penetrated a thick forest of fir trees. What Robert found interesting about the path was that it was unnaturally straight, and what he found oddly frightening about it was that it was so narrow, only a couple of feet across. Spreading your arms, you could touch both sides of the forest, provoking a deep feeling of overexposure and claustrophobia. Standing with his mountain bike only a few feet from the beginning of both forest and track, he felt uneasy about the current situation. It was clear that the path was the only way forward, and while it appeared as though it exited the forest a few miles onward, there was something inherently dubious about it. What? Robert could not tell, but he did feel that he did not wish to traverse it. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. He looked back to check his progress and realized he had covered most of the trail. But as he turned to move forward, Robert saw something that made him wish he had never kept going. It was there, unmistakable, unwavering, and utterly paralyzing. Some distance away in the direction he was heading stood a figure. Robert could not entirely define or make out the discrete features of the person because they were standing to the side of the path between a cluster of trees covered in shadow, but this was certainly not his imagination. Then it was gone, disappearing back into the forest, but the feeling of danger, of the necessity to flee, did not diminish or decline. Instead, it grew in intensity. The sound of something moving between the trees rang out across the emptiness, increasing in volume as it neared. Robert panicked, turned and cycled as quickly as he could in the direction he had come. So eager was he to escape that narrow passage that he did not see a deep hole in the ground. The front wheel of his bike crashed into the depression, sending Robert flying over his handlebars, scraping along the ground. He was dazed for a moment. Blood was dripping from a wound in his leg, and his arm was badly bruised from the impact, but all he cared about was escaping from that suffocating pathway. Robert's beloved paint job across the etched letters Rob on the bike's frame had been scratched slightly in the crash, but that did not concern him. Two spokes on the bike's front tire were broken, and that most certainly did. The last thing Robert needed was to be completely stranded there, so he would have to ride carefully and hope that the wheel would not buckle, lasting long enough to carry him home. He was now facing the direction he had been traveling for days. The moving sound in the trees continued as Robert carefully, yet at pace, made his way across the broken ground. Despite his obvious advantage of speed, the sound seemed to be only moments behind. As he came closer to the end of the forest path and out into the open, he heard a noise which chilled him to his very core. From within the forest spewed that same shrieking, tortured cry from the nights before. Surely no human could make such a sound. Panicking, he increased his speed as the front tire of his bike wobbled and cracked under the pressure and strain. Finally, he was out of the narrow place, but Robert didn't stop, cycling for hours without once looking back. Only when sure that his pursuer could not have followed did he stop to rest. That night, Robert decided not to pitch his tent or light a fire. He was sure his pursuer was drawn by the light and the sounds at night. He didn't sleep a wink. Around 3 in the morning, the scream came back. As soon as the first ray of sunlight appeared, he grabbed his bike and took off once again. Not one foul noise was heard that day, nor any evidence that his stalker was anywhere nearby. And what I'm about to read now will probably upset you just like it did me. Rationality began to overtake Robert's fear as night once again settled in. Robert concluded after much soul-searching that he had allowed himself to get carried away by the isolation of his surroundings and the admittedly unnerving person he had seen in the forest over the past few days. But surely it was preposterous to believe that he was really being followed. Perhaps the individual he had seen was not the same from that strange island of trees. It would make more sense that it was, in fact, just another camper. Maybe there were a few of them, and that explained the noises. And as for the unfamiliar animal screeching at night, it must just be a species of bird in the area which he had never heard before. That night, Robert was at a campfire. He would cook his food, eat well, and enjoy the solitary countryside as he had intended for such a long time since planning his holiday. And that's exactly what he did. After everything that had happened, he simply decided to relax. So he went to sleep with the fire still burning, and 2 hours later, guess what? He woke up to the sound of something moving outside. And the firelight cast the shadow of someone sitting right there. Robert froze. His mouth went dry and his breathing became shallow and anxious. He could not believe that he had been so stupid as to persuade himself that no one was following him. By lighting another fire, he had led them directly to where he slept, and now they had the upper hand. Really? Who would have thought? Who would have thought? He started looking for something to defend himself with, but he had left all his stuff in the backpack outside. Then he remembered the strange piece of metal he found the other day. It was in the pocket of his jacket. Running his fingers along its once sharp ridges, Robert composed himself, never for a second taking his eyes from the shadow projected by the fire onto the wall. The door to the tent was luckily unzipped, but the 2 flaps from the outer flysheet were dripped over the entrance, obscuring his view. With one eye, he peeked through the slit between the 2 flaps of canvas. There it was, someone sitting at the campfire. By his build, Robert was certain it was a man. The backlight of the campfire made it difficult to decipher any of his features, but the shoulders were broad, strong, and it was clear that this man had been in the wilderness for some time, as it appeared that he was wearing rags of cloth which hung loosely around him. His head was covered in long strands of black, wet hair which had clumped together in places, presumably because it had not been washed for some time. Staring at the back of the man's head, Robert tried as best he could to subdue his fear. He thought that he could conceivably sneak out behind him and knock him out with a blow to the back of the head with a black stone, but that could be murder. And Robert did not even know if the man was violent. Perhaps he was a nomadic type, a gypsy, a traveler? Yes, maybe it was best to wait. Maybe he would just wander off into the woods, although that seemed unlikely. Just as Robert affirmed to himself that if the man made a move towards the tent, he would rush out into the open and fight him head on, he noticed something. Something was odd about the way the man was sitting. First of all, he was sitting still, so still that you would be forgiven for mistaking him for a statue. Not the slightest movement was made, nor was there any indication of life at all. No subtle shifting of weight, no rising and falling of breath. Nothing. While the stillness was unnerving, it was Robert's second observation which bothered him the most. The man was sitting forward, facing the fire, but the shape and position of his upper body and head was somehow off. They did not seem to quite add up. His frame seemed unnaturally positioned. A crackle from the fire, followed by a wayward flicker of light, revealed the truth. The flames lit up the area momentarily, the light bouncing from tree to tree, even onto Robert's tent, and reflect back onto what surrounded it. Two pinpoints of light momentarily shone in the night through black clumps of matted hair. Yes, the man's legs were facing the fire, but his body and head were horribly contorted, twisted into an inhuman posture. The man's legs were indeed facing the fire, but his head and body were facing Robert. This was no man at all. The faint snap of the creature's neck was enough to make Robert bolt into the woods. Even though he was terrified of being hunted by something inhuman, he knew he wouldn't get too far without his bike, so he went back to his camp as the first rays of sunlight began to appear. Step by cautious step, he neared his own camp. There was no sight of whatever had been sitting at that fire staring at him. By now, daylight illuminated the entire area, and after much self-bargaining, Robert decided to reclaim his belongings, grab his bike, and continue as quickly as he could on his way out of the Queen Elizabeth Park. Everything seemed to be accounted for, and Robert even allowed himself a smirk at the thought of that creature at least not being a thief. That smile soon vanished at the sight of his bike. Unharmed? Yes, but strands of some black putrid liquid covered the seat and front wheel. After cleaning the liquid off and packing up his tent, Robert once more continued onwards as fast as he could. The weather was not exactly ideal, but while rain occasionally came, it quickly disappeared, leaving long stretches of journey clear from the wearing effects of the elements. As the day progressed, so did Robert's unease. He felt oppressed on all sides, as if he was running from something terrible, yet nearing an undefined danger. A horrible realization bubbled up from his subconscious. What if that thing followed him all the way home? As these thoughts whirled around in his mind, he passed over the crest of a hill and down again, suddenly realizing what was wrong and why he was feeling so much unease about what lay ahead. A gulf in the land opened up before him. Pockets of stagnant water lay strewn between stretches of marshland and long grass, and in the center, there it lay, that horrible island of wretchedness. It was the woods where Robert had first seen his pursuer, and then, in a flash, it all made perfect sense. Like many of us, Robert used to hear stories of people disturbing graves and ghosts rising up to hunt them afterward, but he never took those stories seriously. At least, not until now. He realized that maybe he had unleashed all the horror of the past few days. He had taken something that didn't belong to him. After hiding his bike in the long grass, Robert trudged towards that isolated pocket of woodland where what he knew now to be a grave lay, minus one oddly shaped black stone. He half expected that thing to be sitting next to its resting place, but while there were a number of strange noises and movements between the trees, there was no sign of Robert's unwelcome guest. He assumed it was still out there, looking for him. Finally, he found a grave, the elongated pattern of stacked rocks and stones. After locating the gap where he had turned the black stone from, Robert wedged back in as hard as he could. A noise echoed from the other side of the woods, and Robert did not wish to hang around to find out what it was. Running as fast as he could over roots, mud, leaves, and fallen branches, he jumped out of that dark place into the open outdoors, filled with a sense of accomplishment and utter relief. It was not long before he was back onto the dirt path, moving forward on his bike in search of one more place to sleep for the night, then home the next day. A weight had been lifted from Robert's shoulders. He knew he had unwittingly disturbed something unimaginable, but by returning that which he had taken, he had narrowly escaped what he assumed would have been a terrible fate. There was no explanation for this feeling of elation and survival. He just knew deep down that he had righted his wrong. At that night, Robert lay in his tent. It was dark, as he had decided against a campfire, just to be on the safe side. However, he was confident that he would be left alone, and took great comfort in knowing that he was safe while looking forward to the next day and the comfort of home. Robert closed his eyes with a smile on his face at the thought that next year he would holiday at a sunny resort and lie on a beach for a couple of weeks, one preferably far removed from his homeland. But the noise which he had heard outside for so many nights suddenly screeched at a blood-curdling and overpowering volume. Without having to open his eyes, Robert knew the sound did not come from the woods. It came from inside the tent. Robert Francis was never seen or heard from again. Scotland is old. It has an ancient and hidden history of peoples and places long forgotten, but perhaps some trace remains, isolated and alone in the bitter wilderness. So, should you ever wish to wander the hills, forests, or logs of this old country, bear one thing in mind. If you find a collection of stones heaped together not unlike a grave, and they are surrounded by trinkets of modernity, a sleeping bag, food cans, and perhaps even a note bag with the name Rob etched into it, walk on. Do not look back. Do not touch anything, whether it is an unusual black stone or a simple piece of forest wood. Above all else, never take a souvenir, for those who lie in slumber nearby may just take one from you too. This story is way longer than what I'm telling here. I've just made a little summary, but if you want to read the full version, you can find it on the Reddit forum No Sleep. I'll leave the link in the description below. And once again, if you like this type of content, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye!